North Korea. One of the most isolated country in the entire planet by a long shot. Only a few thousands can access internet. Foreign media is banned. Thousands of kilometers of electrified fences surround its borders. And for decades, it's been hit with some of the harshest sanctions in the world. By every measure, this country should have collapsed. But somehow, it still exists. Why? What's keeping North Korea alive? Let's find out. For decades, North Korea survived because it had a powerful backer, the Soviet Union. It supplied the country with cheap oil, food, machinery, and billions of dollars in economic support. But in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Overnight, that lifeline disappeared. Suddenly, North Korea had to pay market prices for oil and imports, something its struggling economy simply couldn't afford. Fuel shortages spread across the country. Factories shut down. Electricity became scarce. Even farms began to fail, as tractors ran out of diesel and fertilizer became increasingly difficult to obtain. Then things got even worse. Between 1995 and 1996, devastating floods destroyed farmland and food reserves. A year later, drought struck. The country was pushed into one of the deadliest famines in modern history, known as the Arduous March. Estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands and possibly more than 1 million people died from starvation and related diseases. As if that wasn't enough, North Korea also found itself increasingly isolated from the rest of the world. Trade collapsed, foreign investment was almost non-existent, and as its nuclear program advanced, international sanctions made economic recovery even more difficult. By the late 1990s, North Korea had lost its biggest ally. Its economy was in ruins. Hundreds of thousands had died from famine. And to many experts, the fall of the Kim regime wasn't a question of if, it was a question of when. But that moment never came. The regime survived. Which raises an obvious question. Why didn't the North Korean people overthrow it? History has shown that when governments fail to feed their people, revolutions often follow. France, Russia, even the Arab Spring. So why didn't the same thing happen in North Korea? The simple answer is that overthrowing the Kim regime is almost impossible. North Korea is one of the most heavily controlled societies in the world. Every neighborhood is monitored, informants are common, and even family members are encouraged to report suspicious behavior. Criticizing the government, or even listening to foreign media, can lead to imprisonment. And the punishment doesn't stop with the individual. Under a system known as 3 generations of punishment, entire families can be sent to prison camps for the actions of a single person. The cost of resistance isn't just your own life, it's the lives of everyone close to you. But fear alone isn't enough to keep a regime alive. For decades, North Koreans have been raised to believe that the Kim family is responsible for their country's survival. Schools, television, newspapers, and radio all reinforce the same message, while outside information is almost completely blocked. Without access to alternative viewpoints, many people have little way of knowing how the rest of the world actually lives. Even if someone wanted to resist, organizing a rebellion would be nearly impossible. There is no free press, no opposition party, no independent institutions, and almost no way to communicate without state surveillance. So yes, fear and isolation help explain why ordinary North Koreans don't overthrow the regime. But a country's survival isn't determined only by what happens inside its borders. Even if North Korea was on the verge of collapse, it still had one enormous advantage. Its neighbors had their own reasons for keeping the regime alive. And no country has done more to ensure North Korea's survival than China. At first, that might seem surprising. North Korea's nuclear tests have repeatedly embarrassed Beijing. Its missile launches have increased tensions across the region. And Kim Jong-un isn't exactly an easy ally to manage. So why would China continue supporting a regime that often creates problems for it? Because for Beijing, the collapse of North Korea could create an even bigger one. For decades, North Korea has acted as a buffer state between China and South Korea, where nearly 30,000 American troops are stationed. As long as North Korea exists, China doesn't share a border with a US ally. But if the Kim regime suddenly collapsed and the peninsula reunified under Seoul, American influence could move right up to China's doorstep. From Beijing's perspective, that's a strategic nightmare. Then there's the humanitarian crisis. A sudden collapse could send millions of desperate North Koreans fleeing across the Chinese border, placing enormous pressure on nearby provinces and creating an economic and security challenge overnight. And there's another problem. North Korea isn't just any failing state, it's a nuclear-armed one. If the government collapsed, there would be a race to secure nuclear weapons, military bases, and critical infrastructure. Multiple countries could become involved, turning a humanitarian disaster into a geopolitical crisis. For China, a difficult but predictable neighbor is far safer than an unpredictable collapse on its border. Beijing isn't necessarily protecting Kim Jong-un himself, it's protecting stability. But China isn't the only country worried about what happens if North Korea disappears. Ironically, even South Korea, the country that has spent decades hoping for reunification, has reasons to fear a sudden collapse. While reunification has long been a national goal, the reality would be incredibly difficult. North Korea's economy is only a tiny fraction of South Korea's, and decades of isolation have left its infrastructure, healthcare, education, and industries severely underdeveloped. If the regime collapsed overnight, Seoul would suddenly become responsible for rebuilding an entire country. The cost could reach trillions of dollars and take decades to recover. History offers a glimpse of what that might look like. When East and West Germany reunited in 1990, West Germany spent enormous sums integrating a country with a population of around 16 million. Even after more than 3 decades, economic differences between Eastern and Western Germany still exist. But the gap between North and South Korea is even larger, and it's not just about money. A sudden collapse could create political instability, mass migration across the peninsula, and the enormous challenge of integrating two societies that have lived under completely different systems for more than 70 years. South Korea still wants reunification, but it wants it to happen in a stable and manageable way, not through the sudden collapse of the North. So by now, we've seen why China prefers stability, and why even South Korea fears chaos. But what about the United States? If America has considered North Korea an enemy for decades, why hasn't it simply removed the regime? Although the United States has overwhelming military superiority, a war on the Korean Peninsula would come at an enormous cost. Even without nuclear weapons, North Korea's artillery could inflict devastating damage on Seoul within hours. And then North Korea changed the equation entirely. Over the last few decades, one development transformed the calculations of every country involved. North Korea became a nuclear-armed state, and from that moment on, the risks of military action became dramatically higher. During the 1990s, many believed North Korea would eventually collapse under economic pressure. But as its nuclear program advanced, the conversation changed from "when will the regime fall?" to "what happens if it does?" Today, North Korea is believed to possess dozens of nuclear warheads and a growing arsenal of ballistic missiles, including missiles that can potentially reach the United States. That means any attempt to overthrow the regime now carries the risk of nuclear escalation. Even if the chance of a nuclear strike is small, the consequences would be so catastrophic that no country is willing to gamble on it. And that's exactly why, despite decades of predictions, North Korea is still here today. But that leaves one final question. If the Kim regime collapsed tomorrow, what would actually happen next? At first, many people would celebrate, but the reality would be far more complicated. A humanitarian crisis would unfold almost immediately, while countries raced to secure nuclear weapons and protect their own interests. Rebuilding North Korea, reuniting families, and integrating a nation isolated for generations could take decades. In other words, the collapse of North Korea wouldn't be the end of the story. It would be the beginning of one of the greatest political and humanitarian challenges of the modern era. And perhaps that's the real answer to the question we started with. North Korea hasn't survived because it's strong. It has survived because, for every country involved, the uncertainty of its collapse has often seemed even more dangerous than the regime itself.